Hello, this is the last of my Hunger Games videos. The last two were vlogs and this one is more of a discussion based video, and it is on Mockingjay, the final book in the Hunger Games trilogy. We're not reading A Ballad of Songbirds and Snakes, I don't think, or at least not right now. I don't rule it out for the future, but not right now. So at this point I have reread Mockingjay and I have watched both parts of the film, so part 1 and part 2. And this still remains my least favourite book in the trilogy. I should say this, of course, will have spoilers in it, this video. And I still am not a huge fan of the very ending of the story. And by that I mean I'm not a fan of Prim dying, and I'm not a fan of the direction Katniss's life takes after the events of the rebellion and the overthrowing of the Capitol and her returning to District 12. I don't object to her being with Peter necessarily. I mean, I'm still of the view that she is asexual, potentially aromantic, and that really she probably would have done better not having a romantic relationship with anyone. But if she was going to end up with either Peter or Gale, I think it's right that she ended up with Peter. I don't think it was right that she ended up having children because Peter wanted them. I'm slightly uncomfortable with that, particularly given the fact that I'm fairly confident in my feeling that she's actually asexual and, again, possibly aromantic. So I'm not a huge fan of all of that, but I feel like there are more interesting things to discuss about this last book. So I am going to kind of start at the end with Prim anyway, and I'm not alone in this feeling, but some people do disagree, and I know that Joana disagrees with this, which I think makes these two videos particularly interesting because we have a completely different take on this particular portion of the ending. So I am very much in the camp that I don't like the fact that Suzanne Collins killed Prim, or Gale killed Prim, depending on how you look at it, but either way, Prim dies. And for me, it makes it a deeply frustrating and unsatisfying ending to this series, because I'm left with this feeling of pointlessness. And I know that that pointlessness is the point, but I still feel like that point could have been made in different ways, like by Prim being incapacitated in some way, or just something else happening at the conclusion of this trilogy that doesn't invalidate everything that has come before it. The main thing that happens at the beginning of the Hunger Games, the book and the trilogy, is that Katniss volunteers to be a tribute to save her sister Prim. And as a result of that choice, she goes to the Hunger Games, and all of this starts, all of this rebellion starts, but also as a consequence of it, Prim becomes a much stronger person. She's a very meek character at the beginning, and part of that is because she's so young, she's 11, but also, you know, she's always relied on Katniss for everything. And Katniss going off to the games, win or lose, forced Prim to become stronger, and she does. She becomes a really complex character, I think, and by the time we get to Mockingjay, she's learning to be a doctor. She's, you know, she's still an important part of Katniss's life, but she doesn't feel as much of a sideline as she did in the first book. She doesn't feel as much as a means to an end as she did in the first book. In the first book, she was just the means to get Katniss into the games. By the end of the book, by the end of the series, I mean, she's so much more than that. And then she gets reduced to being a means for Katniss's ultimate breakdown again. So instead of continuing to empower this character and use her to exemplify the ways in which this rebellion will improve the lives of the people from the districts, because Prim can now be an autonomous person who can become a doctor, which wouldn't have been available to her in the pre-rebellion regime of Panem. Instead of using that character as an empowerment and an example of how this rebellion has made a positive change, instead of doing all of that, she's once again been reduced to a plot device for Katniss's development. And she's been killed off so that Katniss can have to deal with that loss. But Katniss was already going to have to deal with loss. Regardless of whether Prim died in that way, Katniss would still have been angry with Gale for killing all of those children. Because the whole point of all of this was to stop the killing of children and the oppression of the people. So to win by killing children would have still meant that Katniss and Gale's relationship would have been fundamentally changed. So that could still have happened without Prim dying, and with the added benefit of showing how this rebellion has actually meant something to a character that we know in all the ways I've described just now. But also, she would still have had to deal with the grief of losing people, even just aside from losing people in a more kind of metaphorical sense, like they're still alive, but she doesn't have a relationship with them in the same way as she used to, i.e. with Gale. But she would still have to deal with the fact that Rue is still gone, that Finnick is gone, that so many people have died either by her hands or indirectly because of her and her actions, like all the people in the Star Squad that died through their journey through the capital. She would still have to deal with all of that grief without reducing Prim once again to a plot device. So I don't like the fact that Prim was killed off, and I don't think it was necessary, and I actually don't think it works as well as the other direction that Suzanne Collins could have gone with Prim. That's my opinion. Not everybody agrees. Joanna certainly doesn't agree, but that's my take on it. The other thing that I find interesting about this book in particular, it's a part of Catching Fire, but it's a more prevalent part of Mockingjay, is the way in which mental health is handled, or more specifically, the way in which mental health is mishandled, particularly by those in District 13. So there are all sorts of mental health concerns that are ongoing with our various characters. So we'll start with Haymitch. Haymitch is an alcoholic. That is a mental health condition. And in District 13, their resolution for that is to force sobriety upon him by not providing him with alcohol, not enabling him to drink alcohol. Now, that does mean that he is sober throughout the vast majority of this book. However, he's still an alcoholic. He's just a sober alcoholic because he doesn't have access to alcohol. They haven't, quote unquote, fixed him, because recovery from an addiction like alcoholism requires the person to A, want to recover, be in a space where they feel like it is something that they want to recover from, and for them to become an active participant in that recovery. By forcing sobriety upon him, they are not helping him to deal with his alcoholism, and they're not helping him to deal with the PTSD that arguably caused that alcoholism. So that is one example of poor support for mental health. You see the same thing with Joana. So Joana now has a phobia of water. She's hydrophobic now, okay, because of the torture that she suffered in the capital. And this is in the book only, not the film. Some of these things happen in both the book and the film. This particular one is only in the book. So in the book, there's this whole kind of training sequence that Katniss and Joanna Mason go through. The point of the training sequence in the book is that if they can prove that they are both battle ready, then they will be allowed to go to the capital, and if they can't, they won't. And for the final siege on the capital. And the end of this training process is that they have to go through a test to determine whether or not they can deal with what has been perceived as their greatest weakness. For Katniss, that is not being able to take orders, and she passes. However, for Joanna, her greatest perceived weakness is her hydrophobia, which is not her fault, and which has not been treated at all by District 13. Instead, they throw her into a situation to test her capability to deal with her hydrophobia without ever having warned her that that was going to happen, or provided her with any support to combat that. So of course she fails, because she has a medical condition, which means that she is afraid of water. Katniss doesn't have a medical condition that forces her to not take orders from people. That's just her personality. She recognises that about herself, and I mean, she doesn't really change in the long term. She still is the same person that she's always been, but she is able to pass the test because she's able to think rationally in that situation and adapt her actions in such a way that enables her to pass her test. Joanna, however, she has no control over this phobia, and they disregard that, put her in that situation, and then of course she succumbs to her phobia because she hasn't been given any tools to deal with it. She isn't able to think rationally in that situation because she's hydrophobic. Katniss is suffering from PTSD. She has, for the past, I don't know how time is passing in this, but I think 3 years, she has been constantly subjected to trauma after trauma. She has seen death. She has had to kill people. She has had to see people that she cares about die. She has had to see people that she cares about go through pain. She herself has had to go through pain, both physical, emotional, psychological. She has suffered immensely, as have all of our characters. And what does 13 do about it? It continues to put her in situations that will trigger her. They send her to District 12, where she can see the skeletons of the people from her district strewn everywhere because of her actions in the games. They send her to District 8, where she witnesses the bombing of a hospital full of children and other people who were injured in the rebellion that she incited, and they were bombed because she visited them. They continue to put her in these situations that trigger her PTSD, and meanwhile the only treatment they give her for that is make a list in your head of all the things that are true. That is not treatment for PTSD. Now, you could argue that this society does not understand these mental health concerns. That may be true, but she is still a child, and these are still adults placing her in these situations that are dangerous to her physical health as well. So even if they don't understand the mental health side of things, they still definitely understand the physical health side of things, and they still keep putting her in these situations. So this isn't a criticism of the book, by the way. This is a criticism of District 13, and I think that the way that all of that theming happens, particularly in this book, is incredibly interesting. And I think that as I have got older and my life experiences and my work experiences have exposed me more so to mental health, it's something that I find really interesting, and so consequently each time I read this book I find those elements of it more and more interesting. So that was more of a discussion of the story of this book, but also the films, because the films deal with the same topics that I've just discussed. The very ending, the prim situation and the mental health situation is the same in all three books, in all three forms of media, so the book and the two films. So there were a few things cut out of the film for various reasons, most of them to do with the length and also various casting decisions, like the fact that Delhi Cartwright wasn't mentioned in the first film and therefore didn't appear in the third film. They sent Prim in the fourth film technically. They sent Prim in to speak with Peter instead of Delhi. I don't think it works quite as well, but it was necessary because they hadn't cast that character and they hadn't mentioned her in the first film, so it wouldn't have made sense to put her in. But otherwise, I thought the films were pretty good. They are just as devastating as the book is, and yeah, those are my thoughts on Mockingjay. Still my least favourite, but definitely a complex book, and I've now been talking for nearly 20 minutes, so I'm gonna stop talking now. Don't forget to check out Ponderful Books in the description, and that's it for this one. Thank you so much for watching. If you like this video and want to see more like this from me, then do think about hitting that subscribe button, and I hope to see you here again soon. Thanks, bye!